Bullets punched the barn wall like angry hail, splintering wood inches above Eliza's head. She dropped behind a trough, hands shaking so hard the rifle nearly slipped from her grasp. Smoke drifted through the darkness, slow, ghost-like, lit only by the orange flicker of flame catching hay. "Stay low," Gideon growled, his voice steady as the ground beneath him. Another shot cracked. Cattle wailed against their pens, hooves hammering the dirt in blind panic. The trough trembled against Eliza's shoulder. She pressed her cheek to the cool metal and tried to breathe. "Tried. Her voice stumbled. "I've never held a gun before." The rancher didn't look at her. He just pressed his palm to the rifle barrel, pushing it toward the shadows. "Fear hurts. It passes." Something crashed in the corral. Boots, more than one pair, moving fast. A man shouted orders, the words too far to catch, only sharp enough to sting the night. Gideon lifted his revolver, eyes narrowing like a hawk's. "3 of them," he whispered. "Maybe 4. The yard gate rattled under force. Firelight clawed at the roof of the barn, orange crawling higher, licking at the rafters like hungry tongues. Sparks drifted past, carried by a dry wind that tasted of dust and coming ruin. Eliza blinked sweat from her lashes. The rifle shook against her shoulder like a frightened animal. A bullet ricocheted off a watering bucket. Metal screamed. Eliza flinched and nearly dropped everything. Gideon caught the barrel again, firm. "They want us scared. Don't give them what they rode for." Horses snorted in the dark. One man laughed, low, confident, the kind of sound that cut deeper than any bullet. Eliza's throat tightened. She pressed her back harder against the trough, forcing breath in, pushing panic down. From the corner of her eye, something gleamed near the dirt. A small metal half buried, caught by the flickering fire. She didn't reach for it. She only stared, confusion swallowing fear for a heartbeat. Gideon saw her looking. He shifted, blocking her view. No explanation, just a shadow, sliding over the object like a secret shutting its own door. Another burst of gunfire. Gideon returned a single shot, slow, deliberate, like someone who already counted where every bullet must go. The night held its breath. Then silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that waits with its finger on the trigger. Eliza dared lift her head an inch. Smoke curled thick above them, rising into a sky that offered no moon, only the red shine of burning hay. "They'll be back," Gideon muttered. Her breath trembled the way her hands did. "Why us?" she whispered. Gideon didn't answer. He just watched the darkness where the riders vanished, jaw clenched tight enough to break teeth, as sparks drifted over him like falling stars dying before they could shine. Smoke curled into the pale morning sky, trailing like a wound that refused to close. Eliza knelt among the charred beams, the acrid sting biting her nose, while Gideon inspected the scorched fence lines with hands wrapped in dirt and soot. Every snapped post and scorched plank told the same story. They had not come for money. They had come for blood. They weren't robbers, Gideon muttered, voice low, gravelly. They knew exactly what they wanted. Eliza's eyes darted to the horizon. The hills pressed like silent watchers, shadows stretching long across the dry, cracked earth. "Who?" she began, then faltered. Gideon didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the burned-out cabin at the edge of the property, boots kicking up dust and ash. The door hung on a single hinge, warped and blackened. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and old secrets. Names carved deep into the doorframe caught Eliza's eye. Sarah, Mary, dates that stopped a breath in her throat. "They're gone," Gideon said quietly, almost to himself. His hand brushed the carvings, tracing lines that trembled with memory. All of them, taken years ago, left for ashes. Eliza swallowed hard. She saw the warm metals lying among debris, half buried in the dirt like forgotten bones. She reached for them instinctively, and Gideon's shadow fell across her hands, stilling her movement. "Not yet," he said. "Some truths burn hotter than fire." A sudden clatter drew her gaze outside. Wind or rider. Dust spiraled from the distant canyon path, teasing the edges of her vision. Gideon stiffened, eyes narrowing at the horizon where the hills met sky. "They know this land," he muttered. "They remember me." Eliza's stomach twisted. The tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. It was more than grief. There was anger, too, and fear. Fear for her. A crow wheeled overhead, harsh caws slicing the quiet, and Gideon's voice cut through the air, low and deliberate. "If we run, they'll burn this world behind us. Every ridge, every hollow. They'll leave nothing." Eliza trembled, gripping the rifle tighter. She wanted to flee, but something in his tone held her, tethered her to the dust and ruin. She could almost hear the past speaking in the wind, whispers of battles fought, friends lost, promises broken. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked softly, voice barely more than a sigh. Gideon's eyes met hers, storm gray and unyielding. "Because some debts cannot be run from, and some wounds can only be faced." A breeze kicked up, scattering embers across the yard. Eliza realized with a shiver that this wasn't just about defending a ranch. It was about history catching up, about vengeance riding in with boots that knew the same dust he once walked. She glanced at him, this quiet, unassuming rancher, and saw for the first time the steel beneath the sweat and soot. A man who had carried more than a rifle. A man who had carried a war inside him, still burning, still waiting. And for the first time, Eliza understood that the hurt she felt, the trembling in her chest, the fear in her hands, was only the beginning. The canyon echoed with hooves long before the riders appeared. Eliza's heart thumped against her ribs like a drumbeat in the quiet morning. She crouched behind the ridge, rifle trembling in her hands, dust in her eyes. "Steady," Gideon whispered, his shadow stretching over her like a shield. His hand brushed the rifle barrel, guiding her grip. "Breathe through it." The first rider emerged, a stranger at first glance, cloaked in dust and menace. But Gideon's eyes narrowed instantly. Recognition flashed across his face, sharp and bitter. "They're not just any men," he said, teeth clenched. "They're my own." Eliza froze. "Your men." Before he could answer, another horse thundered past the ridge. The rider's hat tipped back, face cruel, familiar. The voice came, cold as winter dust. "Gideon, you thought you could hide." Shock stilled her blood. Gideon's jaw tightened, and the rifle in his hands became an extension of his will. He wasn't a simple rancher. Every stance, every glance, every precise adjustment of his weapon screamed a history she hadn't known existed. "They were deserters," Gideon muttered under his breath. "From my unit, my command. Turned outlaw. Thought they could settle old scores in the open." Eliza swallowed, hands still shaking, but something inside her ignited. She had watched him move with calculated patience, like a shadow knowing every turn of the land, and she understood, for the first time, the magnitude of what she was witnessing. The leader dismounted, spurs clinking, eyes locked on Gideon. "Tamape, old friend." Gideon's hand rested on the grip of his revolver. "Not today," he said, voice low, steady. Then his gaze flicked to her, eyes sharp but calm. "You stay behind me." Eliza's pulse raced. Her finger hovered on the trigger. She had never fired in anger, never faced a man with death in his eyes, but the moment had come. A quick rustle in her pocket reminded her of the small locket Gideon had given her, the only thing she had of his lost daughter. She held it tightly, heart pounding, as if it carried the courage she lacked. The outlaw leader laughed, a sound that scraped the air. "Didn't think you'd bring company." Gideon's eyes didn't leave him. "She's not just company. She's my promise kept. And tonight, you answer for every wrong you've left behind." The tension coiled tight, thick as the dust choking the canyon floor. Eliza's hands no longer shook. Her breathing slowed. She aimed. One step, one heartbeat, one pull of the trigger. She could change everything. And then she did. The shot cracked, startling the canyon into sudden silence. The outlaw leader's horse bolted, hooves thundering, and he yelped, caught off guard. Eliza's hands still held the rifle steady. She turned to Gideon. His jaw loosened, just enough for a small, grim smile. "You did what I couldn't," he whispered. Eliza realized then that the trembling in her chest had transformed into something else. Iron. Hidden iron, strong and sharp, just like the man she had thought was only a rancher. The desert floor shook beneath thundering hooves. Dust rose in towering clouds, swallowing the horizon, hiding shapes that moved with deadly intent. Eliza's eyes burned from grit and sweat, rifle pressed to her shoulder, heartbeat pounding like a war drum. "They're coming back," Gideon said, voice low, steel threading through exhaustion. He swung onto his horse, boots digging in, revolvers glinting in the first streaks of dawn. "Stay behind me." Eliza didn't move. She had learned more than fear tonight. She had learned the rhythm of danger, the pulse of survival. Every sound, the creak of leather, the rattle of spurs, the wind slicing through canyons, was a signal, a warning. A shadow loomed across the ridge. The outlaw leader, face pale from rage and surprise, drew his pistol. "Gideon," he spat, "I told you, you couldn't hide forever." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't hiding. I was waiting." Shots erupted, fire crackling across the barren ground. Gideon moved like a ghost, precise, lethal, each shot placing a man out of the fight before he could blink. Dust swirled around him, sunlight catching on the brass of his guns, turning him into a figure from the old stories whispered around campfires. Eliza pressed herself against a rock, chest heaving, until the leader broke cover and lunged toward Gideon. Time slowed. She raised the rifle, breath steady. This was no longer about learning, about trembling. It was about survival, about protecting the man who had quietly carried a war in his bones for decades. The shot rang out. The leader cried, horse bolting under him. Silence hit like a hammer. Only dust and the faint moan of injured men filled the air. Gideon's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, guiding her down the slope. "You did it," he murmured. "You did what I couldn't." She blinked, seeing him in the full morning light, scarred, tired, a legend living in plain sight. Blood streaked his sleeve, but his eyes were alive with relief and pride. He slid from his horse, collapsing onto the sand. Eliza ran to him, hands shaking as she pressed against his chest. "Are you alive?" he whispered, though his breath was ragged. "The hurt passes when someone keeps living." The wind carried ashes from the burned barn, scattering across the dawn. Eliza knelt beside him, watching the horizon where the raiders had fled. The first rays of sun caught her face, golden and fierce, as she realized that courage didn't belong only to the battle-hardened. It belonged to those who dared to stand, trembling at first, but unyielding in the end. And then Gideon smiled faintly, eyes closing. "Tell them the story," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Eliza nodded. She would. Every whispered tale around the canyon fire, every legend told in the saloon or along dusty trails, would remember the night the rancher and the trembling girl faced vengeance, and the girl became the hidden iron of the frontier. Some say she still rides out past the canyon dust, rifle at her side, eyes sharp as steel, carrying the legend of a man who taught her that fear can pass, and that courage can be born in the heart of trembling hands.